One of the most common questions that comes up from consumers and clients is, what can you do without a permit, and what do you need a permit for with regard to home repairs or upgrades or remodeling? Today we're going to look at 7 common types of repairs and whether or not it needs a permit, why it would need a permit, and maybe why you can get away without a permit. And those items, we'll read through them real fast and then we'll get into each one, are decks, exterior decks, sheds, a disposal or other appliances, removing or replacing an interior wall, redoing your driveway, doing a roof project, or a garage door opener. In addition, we're going to talk about electrical and plumbing, because those come up a lot within all these elements, and how you can work with a permit, without a permit, and maybe as a homeowner, how you can do something without having to hire a licensed contractor. So let's take a look at these. As always, put your comments below so we get some feedback on what your thoughts are. And remember, these answers sometimes are different in different jurisdictions. Don't take any one person's word for it. Make sure you get good legal advice if you're going to do something, and don't rely on the video to tell you what you need a permit for. Check your own jurisdiction of what's required in your area. So the first and one of the most common types of projects people do on their house is putting on a deck on your house. And does that need a permit? Well, in most jurisdictions, county, city, depending on where you're located, a ground level deck smaller than a certain size does not need a permit for you to do yourself. What triggers a permit in many areas is the height of the deck. If the deck is above sometimes 30 inches, 36 inches, some places it's 2 feet, 24 inches, you need to have a permit. And why is that? Well, the reason is, if you're doing a deck without a permit and you're doing it yourself as a homeowner, and if you build it wrong and it collapses, well, if it's at ground level or a foot tall, it's probably not going to hurt anybody that bad. If it's 3 feet or higher and that deck falls and people are on it, somebody could get hurt. And there's things you can do when you're building a deck. There could be serious problems that don't look like you're doing anything wrong, but if you do attachments incorrectly, use the wrong kind of fasteners that rust out, or use the wrong kind of joist hangers, that deck could fail a year, 2, 5 years down the road, and somebody can get hurt pretty bad. Another trigger for decks, in many cases, has to do with how it's attached. If it's a ground level floating deck, meaning it's not attached to the house, then you're fine. If you attach it to the house, many times you need a permit, because that attachment needs to go on a ledger board with flashing so water doesn't get into your house envelope. Look, you have siding on your house, and that siding helps protect what's behind it, the sheathing, the insulation, the interior of your house. And if you attach a deck incorrectly, you could introduce moisture and water into the boundary envelope of your house and destroy the interior of your house. You can get mold, it can get into even floors below. So that's one of the other triggers that sometimes is an issue. If it's attached to your house, you need a permit. Another issue is the size. If the deck is bigger than 400, 500 square feet, you might need a permit. The other reason for having a permit if it's higher is because above a certain height, you need a railing. If you have a deck above 2 feet, you don't want it to be open on the end, somebody could just fall off and get hurt. So those are the triggers. Those are the things to look into. And make sure that even if you are allowed to do a deck without a permit, that you get some good advice. Watch several YouTube videos. Make sure you're using pressure-treated lumber. Make sure you have it fixed to the ground properly so that it's not going to sink. It's not going to get rot, mildew, right? And it's not going to be all crooked. You want it to be nice anyways, even if you don't have a permit. Number 2 is a shed. It's kind of related to a deck. There's a lot of triggers that are similar. In most jurisdictions, a shed does not need a permit if it meets certain criteria. Some places it's the size. There's many areas where there's a trigger size, 150 square feet, 200 square feet. Some places it's 100 square feet. If you build a small deck and it's below a certain height, sometimes 12 or 15 feet, you don't need a permit. You still have to abide by the land use conditions, meaning that it has to have a certain setback. It can't be right up against your property line. You might need 5 or 10 feet away from a property line. You might need to be 5 or 10 feet away from your existing structure. You might need to have a setback away from existing utility lines, like where the sewer line goes, the septic system is. Maybe your electrical, you can't put it above where the electrical comes into your house. You still have to abide by those. So even if you don't need a permit, you probably have conditions you have to abide by. Some parts of the country, you can't build the shed in front of your house, between the house and the street. You have to build it behind the house. So be aware of what your criteria are. And again, even if you don't need a permit, you want to do it correctly. You want to have it properly affixed to the ground. So if a windstorm comes, it's not going to tip over your shed or blow it into your neighbor's yard or tip over your fence. Those are a lot of the trigger terms. Now remember, as soon as you start doing something with that shed with electrical or plumbing or anything that is a little more advanced, that's probably going to trigger needing a permit. Because electrical almost always needs a permit. What some people do to get around that is if you build a small shed, power it with solar and LED lights. We have a client that put a nice shed in their yard. We did some of the footings and construction for them. They did a lot of finish work, and they didn't want to pull electrical permit. So what they did was they put 3 deep cycle car batteries, 2 solar panels on the roof, and a bunch of LED lights. Have a regular light switch. It's all low power. Didn't need a permit. And it lights them up fine. They don't have an outlet to plug in a bandsaw, but at least they have lights and a little fan, and it makes it more comfortable. The third one is something that people run into quite a bit, and that's kitchen appliances. Look, if you buy a dishwasher or a clothes washer or an oven or a stove, most of the time you don't need a permit because it just plugs in. Most dishwashers have a regular standard plug that plugs into a wall outlet. Anything where you don't have to open up electrical boxes and do wiring, most of the time doesn't need a permit. A dishwasher is kind of a gray area in some places because you do have to plumb in water. Now, most of the time, the water line screws on like a hose, so you don't have to open up pipes or cut pipes. And the drain from your dishwasher plumbs in with a little clamp onto your drain line for your sink. So technically does not need a permit because you're not breaking open or opening up any water or sewer pipes. Same thing with a clothes washer. Clothes washer plugs in and it has a drain line that just dumps into an open drain, and it has a screw-on type valved water feed. Now, a disposal is a little bit different. A disposal seems like it would be simpler because it's much smaller. Well, why do I need a permit for that if I don't need one for a dishwasher? Well, here's the problem with a disposal. When you install a disposal into your kitchen, that is not a plug-in appliance. It has 2 bare wires hanging out the end that you have to wire into an electrical box because it's switched. You have a switch somewhere. In addition, you're breaking open the sewer system, your drain system, your P-trap, to put that disposal in. Now, people do this all the time without a permit. But technically, in most jurisdictions, you probably need a permit to do this. If you don't get a permit, the SWAT team's probably not going to swoop in and lock down your house, red tag your house, but be aware that there's a reason for it. Reason number 1 is you're dealing with electrical. If you wire it incorrectly, it's a fire hazard or a shock hazard. If that wiring is not done right and you touch your metal sink or your valve for your sink and there's electricity going to it, you can get shocked. Electricity is no joke. You're also opening up your main drain to your sink where you can have sewer gases that come into the house or back up, and that could be a health hazard. So even though you don't need a permit, even though you need a permit but might be able to get away with it, it might be a good idea to at least look into what you're doing to make sure it's done correctly. Plus, it's a pain in the neck to put it in. To get it aligned right and attached at the bottom of the sink, it's not an easy job. What about a wall, an interior wall of a house? Can you remove one? Can you add one? Well, it's a gray area. In most jurisdictions, a non-structural partition wall technically doesn't need a permit, as long as you're not changing the function and structure of the house. However, you want to make sure if you're demoing a wall, removing a wall, that it's not load-bearing. If it's a true partition wall that's just there without holding up the ceiling or the second floor, you're probably going to be okay. Where it gets tricky, again, is with electrical. If that wall has plugs in it and you're removing that wall, now that triggers a permit, because now you're dealing with electrical and you have to disconnect circuits and rewire devices and put conductors in the wall. If you're adding a wall, you might think, well, there's no electrical because I'm not changing anything. Well, most states in the electrical code, the National Electrical Code, requires that any wall that's more than 4 or 6 feet, depending on the use, has an outlet every 6 feet. If you build a wall, you're now adding 6 feet of run that doesn't have an outlet, so you're required to add an outlet to that partition wall. Even if it's a knee wall, a half wall, have to have an outlet. And the reason they do that is because they don't want extension cords running all over the place. They want outlets available at regular intervals. So while a partition wall removal or addition might be doable, and you might want to tackle it yourself, just be aware that the electrical aspect of it might be a trigger for a permit. Look, it doesn't mean people don't do it all the time. That's not what we're saying. It's just that technically, is a permit required or not? The other kind of takeoff on that is if you want to open up a wall to have a pass-through. That's a little bit easier. If you're not breaking through any electrical and you're not taking out a load-bearing wall, you can build a pass-through. Just make sure you still need to put a header above that pass-through. Even if it's not a load-bearing wall, you want to have a header to support the weight of what's above it. What about a driveway? Well, in most cases, you can redo your driveway without a permit. However, anytime you're excavating or digging, especially near the road, you want to know where your utilities are. You can just call before you dig, 811, have them come out, paint the lines so you're not digging too deep. You don't want to hit a sewer pipe. You don't want to hit a electrical line, hit somebody's water main so nobody has water in your neighborhood. You have a big puddle in your front yard. Any excavation, you want to make sure you're marking your utility lines before you start, and also want to make sure that however you install it is going to be good for the long run. You have a good gravel base. If you're doing concrete, you want to make sure you have rebar and proper settlement of that driveway so it doesn't crack at a later date. Keep in mind that even vibrations above the ground can break water mains. We had a case where somebody was chopping down a tree and the tree landed on the front yard of this house, and the impact of the tree hitting the ground broke a water main that was 3 feet underground because the tree was so heavy. So keep in mind that if you're using excavating equipment, even if you don't dig down to the water main, that you could disrupt it by vibration. What about a roof? In most cases, a roof repair especially may not need a permit. If you're not doing a tear off, you're not changing any of the sheathing, any of the flashing, if you're just changing shingles, does not need a permit. However, in most cases, a roof replacement is a large enough job where it needs a permit because you're starting to tear things off. You have to replace underlayment or sheathing or soffits or fascia boards. That's going to need a permit. And in reality, a roof is an important part of your house to make sure it has a good dried-in envelope. You're not getting water intrusion, and also that the shingles are attached properly so wind doesn't blow them off. Even though it doesn't, you might have scenarios where you don't need a permit. You may want to get one anyways. Last one we'll talk about is a garage door opener. Garage door opener is an electronic device, but it's plug-in. Most garage door openers have a plug that plugs into an outlet in the ceiling of your garage. Does not need a permit. Just be aware that if you're replacing just the opener motor device and attaching it to the existing opener hardware, you'll be okay. As soon as you start messing with the springs or the tensioners, you want to get an expert involved. We don't even mess with that ourselves as a general contractor. Those springs on that garage door are under a lot of tension, and people have been killed by those things if you undo them and they pop loose, hit you in the head, it'll take your head off. So garage door opener doesn't need a permit. If you start messing with the door or the springs, you probably want to get somebody involved who knows what they're doing. Let's talk about one bonus that we didn't hit on at the beginning, and that has to do with windows and doors. Before we do that, make sure you put your comments below. Let us know what you think or what experience you have in your jurisdiction for these type of repairs. Does it need a permit? Is it common to do without a permit. If you're replacing an exterior window or door, including the frame, in almost all jurisdictions, technically it requires a permit because you're breaking the outer shell envelope of the house. Now, that doesn't mean people do this all the time without permits. If you're just replacing one window or a door that's already an existing shell, it's probably not going to be a problem. Just be aware that windows and doors are the most common locations for moisture, water entry, wind entry, and failures of that HVAC envelope. If you're spending a lot of money to heat and cool your house, you want it to be sealed tightly. You put in a new door and it's not sealed properly, it's not aligned properly, that's where most of your blow through happens in your house. So you're losing all your money. So even though you don't need a permit, if you get some good advice or make sure you do it properly, that might save you $40, $50 a month in HVAC costs if you're in a high use area. We have a property that we did a blowdown test in Texas, and there was a door, brand new door, that had been replaced 2 years prior, and 40% of the air blow through was going through that door, and the door looked fine, and it was a casement around it and moldings. Took off the moldings, you could see through to the outside. You could see daylight because there was no foam insulation. There was nothing blocking that. There was just some shims holding the door in. So you may not be aware of what you need to do to seal that door or window, and you're opening your outside envelope. Anytime you do that, you're giving an opportunity for water to get in behind it when it rains, for wind to come through, and that can do some damage to your budget or to your house. Let us know what you think in the comments, and we'll see you on the next video.